There it is. Oh, hello.
Beautiful.
There we go.
Beautiful. Wonderful. Hi, everybody.
Hello. Tonight we're reading Chapter 10, The Emergent Desert of Beyond Resistance, The Institutional Church Meets the Postmodern World by Reverend John Dorhauer. This is a very short chapter, so we're going to breeze right through it. There's an introductory quote by Vera Nazarian. In the desert, the only God is a well. Joy Lynn Schroeder is a byproduct of the church at its worst. She grew up a devout, practicing Christian in a household of family members who loved Jesus. That faith sustained her well through her time of childhood. As she matured, however, the particular brand of Christianity that she practiced became harder and harder for her to endure. She would eventually realize that her mental health was being threatened, and after suffering a nervous breakdown over it, left the church with no intention of ever coming back. The preachers she heard growing up brokered in fear and guilt. To be sure, they talked about the love of God and Jesus. They taught about the good life made eternal by the blood of the Lamb. They talked about the miracle stories found in the Gospels and testified to God's power to change lives even today. Witnesses were willing to share their own personal stories about the impact Jesus made on their own lives. And while all of this made her happy as a child to know and love Jesus, there would come a time when the accompanying guilt, fear, and doubt would overwhelm whatever kindness, love, and compassion could be found. That guilt would cause her enormous stress. It would eat at her. Beneath the palpable fear of damnation, beneath the guilt born of an inability to lead the perfect life, surfaced emerging doubts and questions about the authenticity of such a gospel. Those questions would haunt her, but they would also trigger the guilt and fear that would continue to eat away at her soul and spirit. In time, the stress and the guilt and the fear would break her. She would be left with no choice but to risk alienation from her family and her faith and leave the church. It was a painful decision for her, but one she could not avoid making. Whatever relief was supposed to have come from such a decision was mitigated for her by a second wave of guilt and fear. The tapes of judgment, condemnation, and damnation kept playing in her head. Having now firmly committed to walk away from Jesus and his church, having told herself that the faith of her childhood could not sustain her, and having wrestled with the demons of doubt, she once again found herself unable to escape the enormity and impact of the voices telling her that because she left, the inevitable outcome would be the loss of her eternal soul. A second breakdown occurred. Time would help. The intensity of the psychological damage done to her by the incessant preaching of condemnation would abate. She would marry a kind, gentle man and become herself a devoted, compassionate mother. Somewhere along the way, she would come to the realization that she was still a spiritual being on a spiritual journey and in need of spiritual sustenance. Returning to church was not an option for her. Like battle-worn soldiers plagued by flashbacks to battles fought years earlier, suffering from post-traumatic stress, Joy could not even think about entering a church building without some of those fears reemerging. She wasn't sure what that meant for her, just that the need for something spiritual would not leave her. She would risk telling her story to others and discovered that she was not alone. Many had experienced the same thing and also found themselves searching for something they couldn't even name. And so it was that Joy would end up opening up her heart and home to many whose spirits had been battered and abused by the church. Before too long, as many as 40 people would gather every Sunday in her home. They would discover the emergent church movement and come to the realization that they were a part of it. She would begin consulting with and learning from and seeking out other emergent pastors. It would slowly dawn on her that she was the spiritual leader of a cohort of gentle souls who wanted to experience something that enriched their spirits and fed them for their own journeys in faith. For some, it would even be less complicated than that. Atheists would find their way to her living room and join the cohort. It wasn't a faith journey for them, but a way to deeply connect with others in ways no one else was offering. I first came to know Joy when she was invited to speak at and attend the annual clergy retreat in the Southwest Conference, which I am called to serve. The entire retreat was built around an exploration of emergent Christianity. It was my hope that we could create an environment where what is emerging could be seen not as a threat to our way of being church, but as an ally in the proclamation of good news and a partner in a shared mission to transform our communities in service to the common good. I had never met Joy. I knew nothing about her or her cohort, Emergent Desert. She was referred to me by a mutual friend, a UCC pastor in the greater Phoenix area. I contacted her and asked her if she would come and lead worship for us. I would learn much later that the specific language that I was using, so comfortable to me, triggered a response of fear and anxiety for her. She doesn't lead or plan worship. She takes on the responsibility of creating experiences that have the potential to be sacred or spiritual or meaningful, but she doesn't lead worship. Additional anxiety would be placed upon her both by re-entering the world of church and by placing herself as an untrained practitioner of spiritual disciples in a room of experts in the field. Only because of her friendship with the UCC pastor and his assurances that this would be a safe space did she agree to come and do this. At the time, I had no idea what a risk she was taking and how much potential damage to her psyche I was risking by making the request. I would only learn that much later. Joy did come to our retreat. It was early evening, shortly after the dinner hour. We were retreating to a beautiful center north of the Phoenix metro area. Surrounded by the desert and the mountains, the glass walls of the sanctuary made for a precious setting in which to encounter the divine. With Joy were her husband and a musician who often came to their house to lead music for the cohort. As the evening light faded to darkness, we sat in a circle together, about 40 authorized clergy and 3 gentle souls, utterly open to what the Spirit might unfold. In the middle of the circle was a small table with a piece of colorful fabric draped over it. We would have called it an altar, maybe it was, but it had nothing on it that would have been familiar to us in the church. Childhood drawings, assorted kitschy knickknacks, toys, a book or two, Lego blocks, etc., were haphazardly strewn across the table and spilling out onto the floor. Joy began with some words of explanation. She talked about her faith journey, openly sharing with these strangers that the church abused her soul and spirit, that the abuse led to nervous breakdowns, that she left the church never to come back, and that she could not fully escape the tug of the Spirit's calling to her. She told us she had no education. She had no credentials. She had no training. She was not authorized by anyone. She had no idea how to plan worship. She confessed her fear to be in this room with us. She confessed as well that she felt like she owed it to us as experts in this field to get it right. She spent some time trying to learn what it is we do when we worship, drawing upon her past experiences in the church of her childhood. After much time stressing out over and trying to come up with something she thought would satisfy us, she finally decided that wasn't what she was being asked to do. Her invitation was to let us experience a truly emergent moment. The last thing she did was tell us that there was no planning involved. Shortly before she came to meet with us, she assembled the assorted items that were on the table. She told us this is what she does. She leads a busy life and doesn't have time to spend preparing anything elaborate for her cohort's gathering. What we see is what we get. With no call to worship, with no introit or prelude to signal that we had begun worship, without us even aware that any transition had taken place, we listened intently as we shifted our focus to the table. Already curious about the theme of the meaning of the metaphors she was using to convey deeper meaning, Joy simply asked us to look at the table. There was no deep meaning she attached to any of it. That's not how we work in worship, but that is not the postmodern way. Everything was there only for what we needed it to be there for. We would bring our own meaning to it. After turning our attention to the table, she simply asked us to sit quietly until something inside us invited us to go to the table and explore its contents. With nothing more to direct or guide us than that, we found ourselves wandering to the table and eyeing the trinkets. Some of us held them in our hands, turned them over. Sorry, I lost my spot. Examine them, touch them, caress them. Without knowing why or how, we all realized we were imbuing these ordinary objects with sacred meaning, and that they were searching something out in our hearts and souls and bodies to touch. Music started playing. A soft voice accompanied the guitar, and familiar songs were playing in the background. No words were spoken. I have no earthly idea how long that went on. I didn't notice, and I didn't care. In ways that organized worship always hopes to do, but doesn't always succeed, I felt the unmistakable presence of something sacred, holy, divine. Eventually, we returned to our seats. Joy simply asked, "What spoke to you, and what did it say?" I became aware of the voices around me speaking. I wasn't listening. I was hearing what I wasn't at all able to focus on, the words that were being spoken. What I was doing was looking intently at a child's painting. It was mesmerizing. There was nothing remarkable about it. It was a typical childhood drawing with inexact figures, primitive shapes, dashes of bold color. I kept wondering if there was a theme to it that I was missing. Sound familiar? We were doing the same thing with the table. Turns out there wasn't, but that's how my mind wanted to work at first. Eventually, I gave in to the notion that this was nothing more than child's play. Minutes went by, many of them, I am sure, and I still couldn't look away. It was speaking to me. No one else was, though their voices could be heard as background noise. At some point, there was an open space in the noise around me. No one else was speaking. I felt intuitively this was my time to speak. I told them this painting spoke to me. I talked about the simple, beautiful notion that the canvas was an utter mess, the byproduct of a child who clearly felt that there was no restrictions binding her, no directions to be followed. Stars were on the ground, flowers in the air, fish on land. Skin tones of green and purple were evident. A mishmash of disconnected items, otherwise completely unrelated, were assembled in this child's mind and on this canvas. What held me spellbound, what spoke to me, was the realization that having spent an entire childhood with those who kept correcting me, directing me, and requiring me to color inside the lines, and because of that, having spent an entire life to this point trying to reach perfection and never capable at all of painting in this way, here I was face to face with a child whose heart was unbound and who could produce a meaningful work of art without restriction. What if God related to us that way? What if the church were reconstructed that way? Without knowing it, I was crying. I was moved literally to tears. I have spent untold hours, days, weeks, months, years, both preparing good worship and sitting through services planned by other experts like me. Rarely have those services rendered such deep and utterly profound meaning. I tell this story not to argue that one model is better than the other. I simply bear witness that whatever she did was authentic. I call it worship. She doesn't. But what she did produced for me a deeply spiritual experience. It was sacred, and my encounter with the divine was real and genuine. The moment did end, and what followed was about an hour of questions and answers. I don't know how many questions were asked and answered, but I need to say two things about the Q&A. First, I remember asking her about sacraments. Did she do communion and baptism? She said that communion feels too much like church to too many, so they're very, very careful with it and largely avoid it. Baptism, though, was another story. She had never done one, and until shortly before that evening with us, had never been asked to do one. But just days ago, one of the couples who came to her house approached her and asked her to baptize her child. This was a lesbian couple, and they had come to feel very much at home in the cohort. The baptism was an important thing to them. Joy had no idea what to do, but she felt a real obligation to honor the request. There was something remarkably genuine in Joy's sense of call here. That's my language, call. But Joy was already beginning to feel what every authorized pastor feels about their flock when called to serve a congregation. These were her people, and the Spirit had entrusted these gentle souls for her care. She confessed that while she had no idea what or how or where, she would soon baptize that child. I was watching the room. There wasn't one expert in the room who felt the need to teach her anything, nor was there one among us who doubted that whatever she did to perform that baptism, it would be an authentic baptism. It was months later before I met with Joy and asked her about that baptism. Her face lit up when she talked about it. They would schedule it on a Sunday afternoon. It would be held in a yoga studio that some of the members of the cohort frequented. Joy would bring a large bowl, set it on a table, and fill it with water. The couple asked if Joy would be offended if they brought a statue of the Buddha, because they also found some spiritual meaning in that. Joy did not object. And so it was that on a Sunday afternoon in a yoga studio filled with people who loved this child and her parents, and some of whom were practicing and avowed atheists, in front of a bowl, watched over by a seated Buddha. So it was that an untrained, unauthorized woman with no idea of what she was doing held a baby in her arms, prayed over her, poured water on her head, and baptized her. Welcome to the Postmodern Church. There are so many more stories to be told about this beloved community. I will add only one more. Once a month, they sit in the laundromat and hand out quarters to whoever comes in. If you are spending your Friday night in Phoenix doing laundry in a public space, You are probably an overworked mother barely making ends meet. This is this cohort's mission. They collect quarters all month. Joy's husband is an avid microbrewer, and every year they sell tickets to a fundraiser in which he sells samples of his product. Bands play, children enjoy various games, etc. The money from that fundraiser is used to help them hand out quarters on the Fridays they visit the laundromat. If anyone is open to it or needs it, they listen. They don't evangelize, they don't preach, they don't proselytize or convert. They pay for laundry. They sit, they listen. A tone point as a result of their Friday visits. Oh, I'm sorry, it's all squished together. There's no spaces.
Yeah, I noticed that.
At one point, as a result of their Friday visits, Joy and her husband took a homeless man into their house. They gave him the spare bedroom, and he lived there until more suitable arrangements could be made. This is the church. This is the body of Christ. This is what Jesus envisioned, and Buddha, and Muhammad, and Abraham, and God. These are children of the Creator seeking ways to experience something profoundly sacred, being fed and nurtured in a community that loves them where they are, and then doing what simple acts they can to make a difference in their world and in the lives of those who suffer unjustly. And that is the end of chapter 10. Chapter 11 is what then are we to say about these things? And I believe chapter 11 is the last chapter, correct, Lynn?
Yeah, that was what I thought too when I looked at this last week.
Yeah. We're one chapter away from finishing our book. There you
How
go.
about that? I'm really moved by how so many people of different beliefs or lack of beliefs can get together
Right.
and celebrate the same thing, whatever that might be. Different things having different meanings to everybody. And it is a realization that's lacking, I think, in today's traditions, in many traditions. And yet it's something that obviously is very much in need.
Right.
The outreach is important. I like the idea of just going in to pass out quarters to a laundromat.
Right. And not, I mean, spreading the word if people want to have the dialogue, but that's not the mission, is not to go in. And I don't mean to call out certain groups, but people that walk the streets and want to hand out Bibles or want to come to your door and have a conversation, that seems a little too invasive,
Yeah.
But I think the idea of if the mission work is to nurture and love one another and do what Jesus is asking or calling us to do, it doesn't matter if you're gathered as a social group, if the social group's intent is to be spiritual.
Right. You're exactly right.
Yeah.
In fact, I think that the closing words about whether it's Muhammad or Abraham or God or Buddha, or it's just respecting and celebrating the same exact thing. It's just loving one another and finding that common ground and finding out what else has meaning in people's lives rather than shoving a specific doctrine down one's throat.
Right.
So all very big points to consider when we look for the vitality and any kind of faith practice going forward.
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, good to see you tonight, girl.
You too.
And your
And Nico
buddy.
too. So
I'll
these
see you
fire,
out walking pretty soon.
yeah, the neighbors have some fire. They're pumping out fireworks, and he gets a little skittish. So
Oh, yeah. Probably not a good idea for us to go out then either. Oh,
no, it's pretty
well-
local by street. I'm not sure where else it is, but it's pretty loud. So
yeah.
anyway,
Well, best to stay in maybe. Thanks a lot.
thank you. I'm glad we got it launched.
See you next week, everybody.
Last week, next week.
Yep.
Bye.
Take good care. Bye-bye.